End of the 1950s and some. The term pop has been used since the early 20th century to refer to popular music in general, but from the mid-1950s it began to be used for a distinct genre, aimed at a youth market, often characterized as a softer alternative to rock and roll. 49-50. From about 1967, it was increasingly used in opposition to the term rock music, to describe a form that was more commercial, ephemeral and accessible. 22. In contrast, rock music was seen as focusing on extended works, particularly albums, was often associated with particular subcultures like the counterculture of the 1960s, placed an emphasis on artistic values and authenticity, stressed live performance and instrumental or vocal virtuosity, and was often seen as encapsulating progressive developments rather than simply reflecting existing trends. 22, 49, 50, 51. Nevertheless, much pop and rock music has been very similar in sound, instrumentation and even lyrical content. NB1. The period of the later 1950s and early 1960s has traditionally been seen as an era of hiatus for rock and roll. 55. More recently, some authors, weasel words, have emphasized important innovations and trends in this period without which future developments would not have been possible. 56, 57. While early rock and roll, particularly through the advent of rockabilly, saw the greatest commercial success for male and white performers, in this era, the genre was dominated by black and female artists. Rock and roll had not disappeared at the end of the 1950s, and some of its energy can be seen in the twist dance craze of the early 1960s, mainly benefiting the career of Chubby Checker. 57, NB2. James Brown performing in 1969. Cliff Richard had the first British rock and roll hit with Move It, effectively ushering in the sound of British rock. 60. At the start of the 1960s, his backing group The Shadows was the most successful group recording instrumentals. 61. While rock and roll was fading into lightweight pop and ballads, British rock groups at clubs and local dances, heavily influenced by blues rock pioneers like Alexis Corner, were starting to play with an intensity and drive seldom found in white American acts. 62. Also significant was the advent of soul music as a major commercial force, developing out of rhythm and blues with a re-injection of gospel music and pop, led by pioneers like Ray Charles and Sam Cooke from the mid-1950s. 63. By the early 1960s, figures like Marvin Gaye, James Brown, Aretha Franklin, Curtis Mayfield and Stevie Wonder were dominating the R&B charts and breaking through into the main pop charts, helping to accelerate their desegregation, while Motown and Stax Vault Records were becoming major forces in the record industry. 64, NB3. Some historians of music, weasel words, have also pointed to important and innovative technical developments that built on rock and roll in this period, including the electronic treatment of sound by such innovators as Joe Meek, and the elaborate production methods of the wall of sound pursued by Phil Spector. 57. Surf music, edit. Main article, Surf music. The Beach Boys performing in 1964. The instrumental rock and roll of performers such as Dwayne Eddy, Link Wray and The Ventures was developed by Dick Dale, who added distinctive wet reverb, rapid alternate picking, and Middle Eastern and Mexican influences. He produced the regional hit Let's Go Trippin' in 1961 and launched the surf music craze, following up with songs like Misirlou, 1962. 66. Like Dale and his Deltones, most early surf bands were formed in Southern California, including the Bel Airs, the Challengers, and Eddie and the Showmen. 66. The Shantays scored a top 10 national hit with Pipeline in 1963, and probably the best-known surf tune was 1963's Wipeout, by the Surfaris, which hit number 2 and number 10 on the Billboard charts in 1965, 67. Surf music achieved its greatest commercial success as vocal music, particularly the work of the Beach Boys, formed in 1961 in Southern California. Their early albums included both instrumental surf rock, among them covers of music by Dick Dale, and vocal songs, drawing on rock and roll and doo-wop and the close harmonies of vocal pop acts like the Four Freshmen. 68. The Beach Boys' first chart hit, Surfin' in 1962 reached the Billboard Top 100 and helped make the surf music craze a national phenomenon. 69. It is often argued that the surf music craze and the careers of almost all surf acts was effectively ended by the arrival of the British invasion from 1964, because most surf music hits were recorded and released between 1961 and 1965, 70, NB4. Mid-1960s, late 1980s, edit. British invasion, edit. Main article, British invasion. See also, beat music, British blues, and British rock. The Beatles arriving in New York at the start of the British invasion, January 1964. By the end of 1962, what would become the British rock scene had started with beat groups like the Beatles, Jerry and the Pacemakers and the Searchers from Liverpool and Freddie and the Dreamers, Herman's Hermits and the Hollies from Manchester. They drew on a wide range of American influences including 1950s rock and roll, soul, rhythm and blues, and surf music. 71, initially reinterpreting standard American tunes and playing for dancers. Bands like the Animals from Newcastle and them from Belfast. 72, and particularly those from London like the Rolling Stones and the Yardbirds, were much more directly influenced by rhythm and blues and later blues music. 73. Soon these groups were composing their own material, combining US forms of music and infusing it with a high-energy beat. Beat bands tended towards bouncy, irresistible melodies, while early British blues acts tended towards less sexually innocent, more aggressive songs, often adopting an anti-establishment stance. There was, however, particularly in the early stages, considerable musical crossover between the two tendencies. 74. By 1963, led by the Beatles, beat groups had begun to achieve national success in Britain, soon to be followed into the charts by the more rhythm and blues-focused acts. 75. I Want to Hold Your Hand was the Beatles' first #1 hit on the Billboard Hot 100. 76, spending 7 weeks at the top and a total of 15 weeks on the chart. 77, 78. Their first appearance on The Ed Sullivan Show on the 9th of February 1964, drawing an estimated 73 million viewers, at the time a record for an American television program, is considered a milestone in American pop culture. During the week of the 4th of April 1964, the Beatles held 12 positions on the Billboard Hot 100 singles chart, including the entire top 5. The Beatles went on to become the biggest-selling rock band of all time, and they were followed into the US charts by numerous British bands. 74. During the next 2 years, British acts dominated their own and the US charts with Peter and Gordon, The Animals. 79. Manfred Mann, Petula Clark. 79. Freddie and the Dreamers, Wayne Fontana and the Mindbenders, Herman's Hermits, The Rolling Stones. 80. The Troggs, and Donovan. 81. All having one or more #1 singles. 77. Other major acts that were part of the invasion included The Kinks and the Dave Clark 5, 82, 83. The British invasion helped internationalize the production of rock and roll, opening the door for subsequent British and Irish performers to achieve international success. 84. In America, it arguably spelled the end of instrumental surf music, vocal girl groups and, for a time, the teen idols that had dominated the American charts in the late 1950s and 1960s. 85. It dented the careers of established R&B acts like Fats Domino and Chubby Checker and even temporarily derailed the chart success of surviving rock and roll acts, including Elvis. 86. The British invasion also played a major part in the rise of a distinct genre of rock music, and cemented the primacy of the rock group, based on guitars and drums and producing their own material as singer-songwriters. 37. Following the example set by the Beatles' 1965 LP Rubber Soul in particular, other British rock acts released rock albums intended as artistic statements in 1966, including the Rolling Stones' Aftermath, the Beatles' own Revolver, and the Who's a Quick One, as well as American acts in the Beach Boys, Pet Sounds, and Bob Dylan. Blonde on Blonde. 87. Garage Rock, edit. Main article, Garage rock. Garage rock was a raw form of rock music, particularly prevalent in North America in the mid-1960s and so called because of the perception that it was rehearsed in the suburban family garage. 88, 89. Garage rock songs often revolved around the traumas of high school life, with songs about lying girls and unfair social circumstances being particularly common. 90. The lyrics and delivery tended to be more aggressive than was common at the time, often with growled or shouted vocals that dissolved into incoherent screaming. 88. They ranged from crude one-chord music, like the Seeds, to near studio musician quality, including the Knickerbockers, the Remains, and the Fifth Estate. There were also regional variations in many parts of the country with flourishing scenes, particularly in California and Texas. 90. The Pacific Northwest states of Washington and Oregon had perhaps, according to whom, the most defined regional sound. 91. The D-Men, later the Fifth Estate, in 1964. The style had been evolving from regional scenes as early as 1958. Tall Call 1, 1959, by the Wailers and Louie Louie by the Kingsmen, 1963, are mainstream examples of the genre in its formative stages. 92. By 1963, garage band singles were creeping into the national charts in greater numbers, including Paul Revere and the Raiders, Boise, 93, the Trashmen, Minneapolis, 94, and the Rivieras, South Bend, Indiana. 95. Other influential garage bands, such as the Sonics, Tacoma, Washington, never reached the Billboard Hot 100. 96. The British invasion greatly influenced garage bands, providing them with a national audience, leading many, often surf or hot rod groups, to adopt a British influence, and encouraging many more groups to form. 90. Thousands of garage bands were extant in the US and Canada during the era and hundreds produced regional hits. 90. Despite scores of bands being signed to major or large regional labels, most were commercial failures. It is generally agreed that garage rock peaked both commercially and artistically around 1966. 90. By 1968 the style largely disappeared from the national charts and at the local level as amateur musicians faced college work or the draft. 90. New styles had evolved to replace garage rock. 90. NB5. Blues rock, edit. Main article, Blues rock. See also, British blues. Although the first impact of the British invasion on American popular music was through beat and R&B-based acts, the impetus was soon taken up by a second wave of bands that drew their inspiration more directly from American blues, including the Rolling Stones and the Yardbirds. 98. British blues musicians of the late 1950s and early 1960s had been inspired by the acoustic playing of figures such as Lead Belly, who was a major influence on the skiffle craze, and Robert Johnson. 99. Increasingly, they adopted a loud amplified sound, often centered on the electric guitar, based on the Chicago blues, particularly after the tour of Britain by Muddy Waters in 1958, which prompted Cyril Davies and guitarist Alexis Corner to form the band Blues Incorporated. 100. The band involved and inspired many of the figures of the subsequent British blues boom, including members of the Rolling Stones and Cream, combining blues standards and forms with rock instrumentation and emphasis. 62. Eric Clapton performing in Barcelona in 1974. The other key focus for British blues was John Mayall. His band, the Bluesbreakers, included Eric Clapton, after Clapton's departure from the Yardbirds, and later Peter Green. Particularly significant was the release of Bluesbreakers with Eric Clapton, Beano, album, 1966, considered one of the seminal British blues recordings and the sound of which was much emulated in both Britain and the United States. 101. Eric Clapton went on to form supergroups Cream, Blind Faith, and Derek and the Dominoes, followed by an extensive solo career that helped bring blues rock into the mainstream. 100. Green, along with the Bluesbreakers rhythm section Mick Fleetwood and John McVie, formed Peter Green's Fleetwood Mac, who enjoyed some of the greatest commercial success in the genre. 100. In the late 1960s Jeff Beck, also an alumnus of the Yardbirds, moved blues rock in the direction of heavy rock with his band, the Jeff Beck Group. 100. The last Yardbirds guitarist was Jimmy Page, who went on to form the new Yardbirds, which rapidly became Led Zeppelin. Many of the songs on their first 3 albums, and occasionally later in their careers, were expansions on traditional blues songs. 100. In America, blues rock had been pioneered in the early 1960s by guitarist Lonnie Mack. 102, but the genre began to take off in the mid-1960s as acts developed a sound similar to British blues musicians. Key acts included Paul Butterfield, whose band acted like Miles' Bluesbreakers in Britain as a starting point for many successful musicians, Canned Heat, the early Jefferson Airplane, Janis Joplin, Johnny Winter, the J. Giles Band, and Jimi Hendrix with his power trios, the Jimi Hendrix Experience, which included 2 British members, and was founded in Britain, and Band of Gypsys, whose guitar virtuosity and showmanship would be among the most emulated of the decade. 100. Blues rock bands from the southern states, like the Allman Brothers Band, LYNYRD SKYNYRD, and ZZ Top, incorporated country elements into their style to produce the distinctive genre Southern rock. 103. Early blues rock bands often emulated jazz, playing long, involved improvisations, which would later be a major element of progressive rock. From about 1967, bands like Cream and the Jimi Hendrix Experience had moved away from purely blues-based music into psychedelia. 104. By the 1970s, blues rock had become heavier and more riff-based, exemplified by the work of Led Zeppelin and Deep Purple, and the lines between blues rock and hard rock were barely visible. 104. As bands began recording rock-style albums. 104. The genre was continued in the 1970s by figures such as George Thorogood and Pat Travers. 100, but, particularly on the British scene, except perhaps for the advent of groups such as Status Quo and Foghat, who moved towards a form of high energy and repetitive. Bob Dylan had come to the fore in this movement as singer-songwriters. 107, Dylan had begun to reach a mainstream audience with hits including